Now, how to choose the regularizer? Okay. So let's go back to philosophizing. Okay. So what does the regularizer do? The regularizer is constraining the model. So what's going to be the best, the perfect regularizer? The perfect regularizer is to constrain the model. So remember, we're going for simpler and simpler hypothesis sets. And remember, what's the perfect hypothesis set? It's the single hypothesis, that's F. Well, we're never going to be so lucky, but we can try to constrain the hypothesis set in the direction of F. But now we're going around in circles because F is not known. Okay? So let's instead step back and look at what's the general principle here. The general principle here is that the regularizer and the regularization parameter, but the regularizer in general, is trying to penalize or is trying to constrain your ability to fit noise. Okay. And noise is in some sense the most complex thing that we can think of, especially, and explicitly so when the target function is hyper-complex. Okay. When the target function is so complex, then you want to prevent your ability to fit complex things. Okay. For example, noise. And preventing yourself from fitting complex things means that your regularizer should encourage hypotheses that are less complex. And this typically means smoother because noise is very jagged. Okay? So the best kinds of regularizers to pick in practice are regularizers that penalize complexity, wiggly behavior of the hypothesis. Okay? And hence weight decay as opposed to weight growth. So weight decay encourages you to fit with a smoother, simpler hypothesis. Weight growth encourages you to fit with, more complex hypotheses. And, weight decay, being constraining you to simpler hypotheses, affects your ability to fit the noise and not your ability to fit the signal or the signal that you can fit, because by definition, the signal that you can fit is simple. It's the noise that's complex. And so the cure outweighs the side effect. Now, if you choose the wrong regularizer, we can still survive if we can pick the right regularization parameter. And that's one of the applications of validation, which we will discuss next. Okay. So, summary. How does regularization work? Okay. You've got noise in the data. You always have noise. You always have noise. And now you can select good features to try to reduce deterministic noise. You cannot do anything about stochastic noise. So you always have noise in the data. Take that as a fact of life. And noise in the data will lead the learning astray. That's another fact of overfitting. So you have to do something about it. And so that means you have to regularize. You have to constrain the ability of the hypothesis set to go after fitting the noise. And why do we have to do that? We have to do that because in order to learn in any useful way, we have to use hypothesis sets that have some reasonable level of expressive power. And once you have a reasonable level of expressive power and there's noise in the data, that expressive power can be led astray. And so we have to constrain it. The alternative is to learn with the simplest possible hypothesis set always, okay? In which case, it's hard to lead such a hypothesis set astray, okay? But then you won't be able to model complex target functions, period. Okay? You won't be able to succeed in learning, very often. Okay. So we need to learn with reasonably sophisticated hypothesis sets, but there is always noise, so we have to regularize. We have to be able to rein in the ability of the hypothesis set and the learning algorithm to fit the noise. Okay, now we can view this in two ways. One way is, the VC angle, where regularization corresponds to a constraint, which corresponds to a simpler hypothesis set, which means that if you can fit with a simpler hypothesis set without, sacrificing too much, then your out-of-sample error will be better, a la VC angle, a la VC analysis. Okay. Alternatively, we can view from the bias variance approximation generalization trade-off. Regularization, sacrifices a little bit of bias for a huge improvement in the variance. But if that huge improvement in the variance comes at the expense of a huge bias, huge underfitting, then it may not be useful. Okay, so these are the trade-offs that exist in sort of regularization. But one thing that is for sure, it is absolutely necessary because there's always noise in the data, stochastic and deterministic noise. Okay. And let's conclude, with the augmented error, which is what we derive today. Okay, so the augmented error is the penalized in-sample error. So it's the augmented error for a hypothesis H, is the in-sample error for the hypothesis H, penalized by a complexity term omega for the hypothesis H. So you penalize the complexity of the hypothesis. Okay, and then you have a knob to control how much you penalize this guy lambda. In our case, omega of H was weight decay, W transpose W. The VC angle is that E out of H is less than or equal to E in of H plus a penalty for the hypothesis set. Okay? And so we've managed to replace the penalty for the hypothesis set with the penalty for the hypothesis. And what we found is that, the augmented error, when we minimize that, can be better than minimizing just the in-sample error. Because of this ability for the hypothesis set to just get totally, misled by the noise and overfit the noise and have very bad out-of-sample error. And that out-of-sample error, so the VC analysis is general, and what that means is this error bar is huge. It has to take into account the possibility of being led astray by noise. Okay, so this error bar will be huge. Okay, but the minimizing the augmented error is typically resulting in much better performance because it prevents you from overfitting the noise. And that suggests that there are many situations, especially when there's noise, where the augmented error is beating the in-sample error as a proxy for the out-of-sample error. Okay. So the augmented error, minimizing the augmented error is better than minimizing the in-sample error because the augmented error, which has this penalty for the complexity of the hypothesis, is more accurately mimicking the out-of-sample error. Okay. The regularizer rules of thumb, we choose regularizers that encourage smoother fits, less complex fits, because the thing we're trying to avoid fitting is noise, which is hyper complex. And that leaves us with the sort of task of setting the amount of regularization the lambda. Okay. And we will discuss validation next. And validation is a tool for choosing this guideline.